Hi, everyone. I'm Camille Tootie. I will be moderating today's conversation. I'd like to first thank Appgate for hosting this event. I'm excited about facilitating this conversation around zero trust and critical infrastructure. Zero trust is something that's been talked about at length over the past year as frameworks and directives have come out to help federal agencies adapt to this new paradigm shift. The executive order improving U.S. cybersecurity calls on agencies to develop a plan to implement a zero trust architecture. An additional blueprint from the Office of Management and Budget lays out a path how to move to the new model by the September 2024 deadline. So what role will zero trust architecture play in our IT critical infrastructure? And what will zero trust in general mean for the federal government's increased use of IoT? Finally, how can agencies protect high-value tech assets with a zero trust architecture? Here to answer those questions are Roger Cressy, who's a partner at Liberty Group Ventures, Jason Garbis, who is Appgate's Chief Product Officer and author of Zero Trust Security, an Enterprise Guide, and Stephen Hernandez, who's the CISO at the Education Department. Welcome all. So I'd like to start off by asking how or what do you define as critical infrastructure assets?
I'll go ahead and dive in. And, you know, for us, there's the very regulatory legal definition of critical assets. And those are pretty sector specific, as it were. We're typically talking about energy, healthcare, the financial sector, et cetera. And, you know, when I boil it down and I'm explaining it to folks who may not have a background, it's like, you know, where do the seams of the nation start to fray or become stressed if they're under attack, if they're not available in particular, if they get corrupted? What are those type of services and those type of systems supporting those services? Because that's really what we're talking about. I think looking through the news, we've seen several examples recently of ransomware impacting critical infrastructure areas, things that actually pose an immediate or in some cases a slightly delayed impact on human life, on human quality of life, on our safety, on our ability to transact and conduct commerce. And I only see it getting larger. When we think about critical infrastructure, oftentimes folks there's an abstraction there, like, well, we don't have critical infrastructure in our environment. But I think that when we start at the agency and department level, we dig through our continuity of operations plans, our continuity of government plans, and it's, you know, what are the mission essential functions, especially those national or primary essential functions that each of us do. We find where we may have those intersections with critical infrastructure throughout the federal government. So kind of a 60,000 foot view, but I think it helps shape the narrative when we think about what is critical infrastructure and how does it impact our world.
Absolutely. Jason, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, I agree with what Stephen said. And I think there's so much of our world, I would argue probably everything in our world is operated by software and technology today that is inherently at risk to disruption and attack, that almost everything, every operation or every function that our departments and agencies and private sector performs is certainly at risk. And there are many, many elements of that we could consider as critical to the operations of our nation and our government outside the legal definition of critical infrastructure. But if you're unable to process payments to citizens, for example, that's going to have a major impact beyond, of course, things that are physically risky, like the water supply or operating sewer systems and things like that.
Roger?
Well, Camille, I think to add to everything here, Stephen took the 60,000. I'll go just a little bit higher to 65,000. And infrastructure protection as a presidential priority. And as you know, we have the 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, but some are more critical than others. And as Jason and Stephen has said, whether it's energy, whether it's financial, telecom, water, the things that we absolutely require and depend upon on a daily basis, both consumer as well as business and then government, those are the ones that we have to focus on. So what the Cyberspace Solarium Commission talked about as systematically critical infrastructure, systematically important critical infrastructure, that is where we have to pay the most attention. But to the point that Jason raised, in an IoT world, the interdependencies that we now are living with on a daily basis make it even more challenging. So one of the things that I like about what we're going to talk about today is how do we address all of these interdependencies, the seams that we have within our critical infrastructure as it's attached to other things, and what do we do to ensure resiliency, redundancy, and guaranteed services to the community and to the nation as a whole.
When we talk about protecting IT critical infrastructure, what has traditionally been the way to do so? And what's been missing from that approach? Stephen?
So in the past, and then I'll go back maybe 15 years, 10 years, critical infrastructure was something, a lot of what we call now OT, operational technology. Before we used to talk about it in terms of SCADA systems, which are basically a fancy way for saying devices that monitor and control often physical elements, actuators and machinery and devices. And in the past, there used to be a huge focus on, well, one, who really wants this stuff and can they find it? That was the big thing. The thing may be on the network, but frankly, if you scan it, it may not even be responsive. That's evolved rapidly. Our attackers have seen that if it's on a flat network and it's easily accessible from the internet, it might as well be toast. But that was part of the challenge in the past is some of the technology that we had in OT and IoT, Internet of Things, it could only work in that type of a configuration. It was a very simple device. You were lucky to have an IP4 network interface on the device, let alone, do you have encryption? Do you have authentication? All these other things. It was never really built to be that way because most of this was built during an era where these concerns weren't front and center. Yet we built things that needed to last 40 years, 100 years, et cetera. And so trying to forecast that and build it in, it just wasn't there. Where that's led us now is that we're asking a lot of hard questions about that. And I think kind of the current state of affairs is most folks have gone down the segmentation path and said, well, if I can't really update the individual endpoints or the individual devices and the interfaces, let's at least try to put them all in one place so we can effectively have hopefully some visibility and management, and then we'll play the border security game. We'll try to keep people out at the boundary. And I think as we move into zero trust, we're challenging that assumption because inherent in that model is the notion that if the device is on this network, we trust it and it's safe. And of course, one of the core tenets of zero trust is that being on the network doesn't confer any sense of safety. In fact, we assume the network is already compromised. So looking back and kind of how we got to where we are today, I think that on the critical infrastructure side and zero trust, that is one of the sweet spots that we have to unpack. And I think that as we look at the different models, that's an area that's still growing and is going to continue to evolve.
Roger, you're nodding along as Stephen is speaking.
Yeah, absolutely, Camille, because part of this is the funny line that some people have, which is the perimeter is dead. Well, the perimeter is dead, but the perimeter, much like the zombie, continues to exist. And you still need a perimeter. You just can't rely on the perimeter. So a defense in depth approach now includes a zero trust component that actually, instead of being laid on the top, is now fundamental and foundational to how you do cybersecurity and ensure resiliency. So that doesn't mean you throw away your firewalls, your antivirus, your IPS, your IDS, your latest software solution. But you got to figure out what is the crown jewels, if you will, and how do you ensure their resiliency and security with everything else going on in your network right now. What's beautiful about the zero trust approach that we're now finally implementing in a way after talking about a number of years is that it's that recognition that we are going to make sure that everything that touches the network has to be verified and there's no implicit access granted, right? You don't trust anything. And I think when I talk to enterprises, regardless of the size, it is you have to be permanently paranoid and assume everything that is touching your network is at risk or could be a malicious entity of some way, shape, or form. So that mindset change, Camille, I think is one of the biggest challenges you have. The good news is we're getting there. The bad news is we've taken a lot of time and had to suffer a number of attacks in order to reach this point. But now we can actually move forward in a much more constructive way.
So Roger, I liked your comment of permanently paranoid. I mean, it sounds a little sexier than never trust, always verify. So from your point of view, what has shifted to kind of spur this paradigm shift to this, permanently paranoid approach?
Well, for years we've talked about, cyber. Every country lives in a glass house when it comes to cybersecurity, given exposure, the ability of others to see in. And our nation is the glassiest of glass houses for a variety of reasons. And for years, we were kind of in denial about what that meant. And I think what has now happened is people recognize that the attack surface has changed. The vectors that adversaries can come in on has grown in a multiplicity of ways, whether it's BYOD, whether it's, choose your own device. All of that becomes part of a broader attack surface and a threat environment that is easily exploitable. Because regardless of how good your technology is, if you don't have this foundational component of a zero trust strategy and culture, the vulnerabilities will always exist and will be exploited. So how do we fix that? And that is part of what the zero trust approach gets to.
Jason, do you want to add to what Roger just said from your perspective?
Sure. I think there's certainly been a recognition in the private sector as well as in the public sector of the need to shift and change the way we're approaching security. It's terribly clear that the threat landscape is not only very active, but that these threat actors, whether they're criminals or nation states, are unfortunately seeing success after success in some very high impact attacks on our infrastructure and our organizations. And I think the good news, as Roger mentioned, is that we are on track for this. There's not only increased awareness of shifting toward a zero trust based approach, which is demonstrably better and results in much more resilient organizational information security. But there's also a mandate, right? With a recent executive order has put this in black and white that says, okay, as federal agencies, you've got a mandate to move forward on this. And I think there was a collective cheer, if you will, among the security leaders in the federal government to say, great, now we have the opportunity to put this at the top of the list, to allocate budget and people to it, and to make it happen. Because I think zero trust really coalesces the best practices, both from an architecture as well as a technology perspective, to really move us forward and make these critical infrastructures in our networks much more sound.
Roger, you're a self-proclaimed recovered bureaucrat. So I'm curious to see what you see in terms of the evolution, because you've been working on these issues for quite a while.
Well, like any good recovered bureaucrat, I still have the highest admiration and positivity towards those still in. So, to Stephen and others who are fighting the fight daily behind the ramparts, I wish them nothing but the best. It is not easy. There are a couple things here, I think, Camille. The first is, for years, people in the community were howling at the moon about you got to incorporate broader cybersecurity into your governance structure in the private sector. The government needs to understand what elements of cybersecurity are absolutely critical to ensuring the mission is successful in every agency, whether it's national security or a civilian. And there was tremendous resistance and reluctance because for many years, people viewed this issue as a nice to have, not a need to have. And I think for many agencies and departments, I've got all these things I got to do on a daily basis. I've got congressional requirements here. My mission requires this and that, but they fail to fold the cybersecurity element of it into their daily mission work and make it foundational. So what have we seen over the past X amount of years? That mentality has changed. Now, the good news is you have, I think, a team in place now with Jen Easterly at CISA, with Chris Inglis as the first National Cyber Director, and the teams they are building, that you are going to have a level of focus and implementation and action on this that we've not seen so far. And that is going to lead to real change. But it's top down, but it's also bottom up, right? We're all now recognizing this is as important an element of our daily life as everything else is in our professional existence, and certainly, of course, in our personal as well. So we're making a lot of progress, but I don't know what mile marker we're on in the marathon, but we haven't hit 20 yet. I can promise you that.
It's a journey, right? Stephen, just a quick follow-up. I mean, you're an agency CISO, so how do you see that evolution of thought really around Zero Trust that Roger mentioned?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because we started this conversation formally in the federal government almost 4 years ago, and the Innovation Committee, Sylvia Burns and Joe Klimovich said, hey, I've been reading about this Zero Trust networking thing, reading some of these case studies, whatever. Acta, could you take a look at this and kind of tell us what your read is? And at the time, I was the government chair of the cybersecurity community of interest, so we dove in. And what was interesting about the evolution was we started with Zero Trust networking, really a discussion around that layer 3 in the OSI model, but quickly discovered that we cannot stop the conversation there. And if we're talking about this in terms of the federal government and how it can intersect with the risk management framework and the cybersecurity framework, we have to think much more about the entire OSI model. And so that's why we had a tectonic shift in saying we're not just going to network, we're looking at the entire architecture. Because in a perfect world, all my Zero Trust intelligence, the capabilities and whatnot, they're driving at all levels, especially at layer 7, because that's where the human or the device or the bot gets interfaced. And that's where we can get the most rich intelligence and sensory information. And I think that our journey is we've started at the networking layer and we've been progressively moving up that stack in terms of what we expect to see in Zero Trust. And from a leadership perspective, that's continued to evolve as well. We're just incredibly fortunate. We've got Jen Easterly, we've got Chris Inglis, and we've also got Chris DeRusha, my co-chair on the Federal CISO Council, our federal CISO. And the three of them have just been working lockstep in making sure that from National Security Council, CISA, and OMB, agencies are getting clear, concise document and direction as to where we need to go. And we're seeing things that we've never seen before. OMB releases a memo, CISA releases a memo, all around the same time, sometimes the same day, and they all come together. They all make sense. And that's just awesome because it makes our job, which is already a lot of fun, so much easier.
And Camille, real quick, I want to double down on something Stephen said. That coordination and the ability of working hand in glove is an enormous advancement. Back in the days when I was doing this at the National Security Council, there was none of that. And so as Jen Easterly mentions often, the multi-seal approach now of CISA and FBI and NSA and other entities working in coordination is enormously important. And that's why you're starting to see real progress.
Yeah, and this definitely has a real impact on the private sector as well. Working as a software vendor, we see these white papers and documents and recommendations come out from the federal government, and our private sector customers, the enterprise side, both in the US as well as internationally, really take these things seriously and read very carefully what CISA and OMB and the NSA put out when it comes to this, and they really take a lot of direction from it. So that, to me, is amazing to see how well the federal government has taken a leadership role globally in this area.
And Jason, from a software perspective, can you elaborate on the 3 key security concepts that Zero Trust is based on?
Sure thing. So Zero Trust is really, it's a security philosophy and a security approach based on a number of core principles. And the three primary ones are, first, to ensure that all access for all users and really all identities when we're talking about critical infrastructure is secured across all locations for all workloads or all access. And that repetitive use of the word all is really important because it ensures that Zero Trust has a holistic model. And we need to get away from and break down traditional security silos. Well, I've got one solution for remote access, and I've got another security solution for on-prem access, and they're completely different. They use different vocabularies and different models. And of course, these things are going to be misaligned. So the first concept is holistic model across all assets and all identities. Second is that access is governed by a set of dynamic policies. And Stephen talked about this a little bit when he talked about moving up from layer 3 to layer 7. This is about defining an access policies that relies both on the attributes of the identity, the attributes of the workload, the attributes of the network, and other things that surround it, like a business process, yet enforces it all the way down to the network layer. And a simple example of that is if I don't have access, if I shouldn't have access to a given application in my organization, of course, I'm not going to have credentials, so I can't log into it because I don't need to access it to do my job. But I shouldn't have any network access to it whatsoever because there's far too many unknown vulnerabilities or the ability to disrupt a system. So the principle of least privilege, it requires that these policies are enforced all the way down at the network layer. So that's kind of the second principle. And the third principle is that a Zero Trust system should log and monitor and analyze all activity in the network. And that's really useful both for informing human and automated analysis of network and security operations to look for anomalies, as well as to help meet compliance reporting requirements.
Stephen, you've been an early advocate of Zero Trust. Can you, and now you just mentioned that you are looking into the highest levels of maturity. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges you've had with this Zero Trust journey and where are you right now in terms of implementation and the approach you're taking?
You know, there's a lot of cultural challenges. I think those are some of the largest hurdles that folks will have to clear as they go down this path. There's a message here, and in cybersecurity, we talk about, well, we don't trust the network. This is not. You know who has a problem with that? Your network engineers who have spent their lives trying to build resilient networks that are safe and that have tooling, et cetera. And in some cases, there may be worry. It's like, well, you know, what does my career look like in a Zero Trust world where the network is literally just a set of pipes and we're just flying through it and it's untrusted? And the bigger takeaway is that, oh, trust me, you're going to be very busy because all the network capability we have for sensory and defending and prevention moves into the Zero Trust model. And frankly, it becomes software defined more so than hardware defined. And I think that, you know, making sure that we have those conversations and also understanding that it's just as much of a cultural advancement as it is a technology advancement, those two have to go arm in arm. Other folks, for example, in security operations, they hear, oh man, Zero Trust is going to bring machine learning and AI and robotic process automation. I'm going to be out of a job. No. Your job's going to become much more interesting because yes, we are going to rely on automation to go through and find what is interesting in the millions and billions of events that we're going to receive. We're still going to need that human involved, but the work is going to be fascinating because it's going to not be sifting through a bunch of events, seeing if something looks interesting. No, this is interesting. Now go tell us more about it. So making sure that that narrative is out there, that in our planning and as we put out our path forward, we are factoring in the people, we're factoring in the cultural evolution as part of this. I think that's the area that catches most people off guard.
And Camille, if I could add to that, there's another element of Zero Trust that I think is also to the mindset point that Stephen made, which is, and this is what the NSA said in one of its documents, which was the Zero Trust model makes an assumption that a breach is likely or has already happened. And that statement is counter to so much of what the industry, how the industry has approached the issue of cybersecurity, because it's all about how can I prevent a successful attack? And implicit in zero trust is you can't. That a determined adversary with the proper capabilities and skills who are out there, whether it's a nation state or someone else, will get in. And so the question then becomes, how do you mitigate and minimize the impact of that adversary in your network? And what zero trust does simply is it addresses that issue. So the mindset is, we are going to be breached, or we already have been breached. How long have they been sitting on our network? What reconnaissance have they been doing? Has there been lateral movement? That change in a philosophy at leadership levels, not at the information technology level, is enormous, because that then empowers a zero trust approach with software defined capabilities, but also ensuring that everybody, whether it's the C level down to the entry level person, knows the mentality is we need to assume it's going to happen. How do we minimize its impact and then ultimately defeat it?
Roger, that's a really interesting point. I would like to ask Jason, how do those conversations shape out when it comes to talking with your federal customers?
I think there's a great deal of not just awareness, but eagerness to really dive in around this. There's been many initiatives throughout the federal government, both in the DoD and non-DoD side, of course, around improving IT and infrastructure security. And I think what this zero trust mandate does, and the types of technical directions, the philosophical approach that Roger mentioned, some of the cultural changes that Stephen mentioned, are really welcome. The security leaders that I've talked to are really using this as the ability, as a catalyst to reach out across their agencies or departments and to partner with non-technical leaders and bring them on board to say, look, we're going to be making the shift here, and it's a cultural change, it's a philosophical change, but we can now enable you to do really interesting things in a way that's secure. You don't have to bypass us, and we're not going to hold you back anymore. It's a way for us to say yes to new initiatives and new technology so we can start moving faster, be more effective, but also become a lot more resilient to this inevitable attack, as Roger mentioned.
So this is a question for everyone. When you sit down and start drafting a strategy for zero trust, what's required? What should be in that plan? Let's start with Roger.
So for years, we've always talked about people, process, and technology. And what I like what Chris Inglis, the National Cyber Director, has started saying is it's people, technology, and doctrine, right? And so the first part of this, I think, is not the technology part, it's the doctrine part. So roles and responsibilities, and as he says quite accurately, who's accountable for what? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is a mission statement of the implicit assumption that your network will be breached at some point, and how do we develop a defensive approach recognizing that? And then the third part becomes the technology, which is what technologies do we need to deploy to ensure the ability of an adversary to have a successful event inside our network is minimized to the greatest extent possible and hopefully eliminated. And that's where you start to pull together all of the technological components to empower the doctrine and then ultimately to empower people to make the right choices, right? So if I'm a person and I'm told, don't trust anything, be permanently paranoid about your activity on your network, you're empowering them with a zero trust mindset and a culture that Stephen talked about that's empowered by everything else. So they all work together, I think, in a much more impressive and compelling way.
Stephen, I want to know what went into your strategy for zero trust, since you've been doing this for a while now.
Yeah, the mindset that was mentioned earlier about this is a journey, and frankly, you may never get to the end of the journey. It's very important. I think when we look at the work that CISA has done in defining a maturity model is really how we looked at defining our roadmap. And we looked at, what do we, and most importantly, what do we already have on the books? We have a strong centralized identity capability. We have a centralized cyber data lake. And these are pieces that you're going to need as you move towards zero trust. And it's really about fantastic recognizing that you already have some of these big blocks in place, but then also taking inventory of what needs to happen to evolve them to plug into that architecture. From there, we took a look at the gaps, and we looked at some of the ACT-IACT work, the ATARC work. There's lots of great publications out there about how to incrementally move towards zero trust, and you have to do it that way. There is no zero trust in a bottle. You pop the cork, pour it in champagne glasses, and you're good to go. It's absolutely looking across the enterprise, and the challenge is you're going to have pieces that are going to be sticky. They're going to be legacy. They're going to be intertwined with so many other systems. You may have some vendor lock-in going on, and that particular component isn't going to play well in the zero trust future. So in some cases, that's a contractual issue you're going to have to work out. Identifying those opportunities sooner, and especially those obstacles where you may need to evolve, transform, recompete, whatever the case may be, that was crucial for us. And it really helped us because we were able to show leadership and have conversations with OMB and others that, look, we're already on our way. And most people are in a position where they can say that because they'll have some of these core pieces. But to get to the next level, we need X, Y, Z. For us, that's SASE and SOAR technologies. The highest horizon for us, the furthest horizon, is really around the machine learning and AI, because if you don't have great data and underpinning for it, it's really hard to get great answers from poor data.
Are there aspects that tend to kind of fall by the wayside when it comes to creating like a successful strategy for zero trust? When you talk with your agency counterparts or even industry counterparts, is there something missing from the discussion that tends to be, is there an aspect that tends to be overlooked?
So I'll start on that, and then I'm very curious to hear the others. I think that for us, the one area we see, and I don't want to say it's overlooked, but it kind of fades away. There's really not much discussion around compliance, which is awesome. This discussion around, are we going to be able to check the box with these things? That's not been happening with zero trust. The conversation has really been shifting towards effectiveness. And that is wonderful. There is a piece where we have to be careful, though, because we do need to show that zero trust can meet these compliance areas, which in almost all cases it can. But the fact that the focus is now on the effectiveness of the deployment, the effectiveness of the program, really resonates with FISMA, because the latest version really challenge us to say, move away from the compliance mindset and into the effectiveness mindset. And so far, that's where the conversation has been. And that's been a very refreshing.
And Camille, just to double down on that. So we're all among friends, so we can say it. FISMA in its earliest iteration failed. Compliance approach has failed the government. The checklist approach has failed. And we've had to have a trial and error process to get to the point of where we are now. And to Stephen's point, we're now seeing a revision to it that is much different. And I think that that's incredibly encouraging. I do think there is a willingness now to give agencies the tools and the resources, thankfully, because Congress really has become enlightened and is much more aggressive in funding it. And that gives us hope. The thing that I like to say often is that, for people like Stephen, he's juggling chainsaws on a daily basis, right? And so we constantly ask to throw another chainsaw into the mix. Hey, see if you can do this one while you're doing everything else. And it's unfair. And what it also does is it doesn't give him and his colleagues the ability to do this in a way that reflects all the other activities they're doing. And the most important one here is the two worst words you can hear in government as a government employee are unfunded and mandate. So unfunded mandates are the worst, and those happen all the time. And I do think where we're going now with a lot of the zero trust work, that's not going to be the case. So again, feel very encouraging about the journey. And the last thing is, Stephen says something absolutely critical. This is not a point-to-point race. This is not a moonshot. I hate the term moonshot. This is about a nonstop exploration that's more than 5 years, to use the Star Trek approach. It just keeps going. So we got to constantly iterate, evolve, develop to deal with how our threat environment changes, how the adversary changes, and how our own network architecture changes with all the new advancements coming down the road.
Jason, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Roger's point is a good one. That in fact, maybe we shouldn't talk about zero trust as a journey, but as a way of life, because our cybersecurity programs are never going to wind down. It's going to continue as long as we exist, because it's such an underpinning and such an important part. I think the openness and the flexibility that I'm hearing around compliance is really encouraging, because compliance rules exist for a good reason, but in some cases, they tend to be very backward looking from a technical perspective. And there's a checklist that says, okay, do you have a firewall that looks like this and does A, B, and C? And if you shift to a zero trust model, you can say, well, of course I've got a firewall, but it doesn't exactly do A, B, and C because there's this other piece that does it better. And that's a great conversation to have. It doesn't work very well with the checklist type of a binary compliance, compliance evaluation. So the newfound willingness, I think, to have some more flexibility there and really look at effectiveness is very encouraging, and I think will help organizations really be able to take a step forward. In terms of challenges, Stephen touched on this a little bit. I think that the cultural aspect is sometimes as challenging or more challenging from a technical perspective. It's making sure that everyone understands, hey, we're going to be changing the way we do things around here, but it's going to get us to a better place, and it's going to make us all more effective and to move away from what is oftentimes too much of a very painful treadmill that we're on, whether it's updating firewall rules or other types of processes, and actually moving to more valuable analytical work.
So Jason, how does a vendor like Appgate help agencies with their zero trust plans? Where do most speed bumps occur if we're talking about the journey, but it's not a journey? We have a new word for it now, but how are those conversations playing out with agencies?
I mean, putting aside the technology, oftentimes the question is, okay, great. I love the architecture. I love the approach. How do I get started? And Stephen touched on this a little bit when he talked about in his arena, they had some areas where they were doing a good job. They had some real areas of strength around, I believe it was the identity management system and some other areas. So organizations definitely need to be realistic and take a step back and say, okay, we do these things over here pretty well. Great. That's a solid foundation for us. These things over here, we're pretty immature and we've got some problems and some issues. And to look at those and say, okay, how can I design my first one or two pretty focused zero trust projects to leverage, let's say it's a mature identity management system and identity management process, and maybe they've got some weaknesses in network visibility and they don't really know what's on their network. How do we do things where we can start to contain that as an area of risk and incrementally build on a new view of the network where we take the highest risk and highest value assets, for example, from this area of immaturity and move them piece by piece or one by one over to a zero trust model. And what that does is that starts to generate a very positive, virtuous cycle inside an organization. You work on the first project for 4 to 6 weeks, you show some benefit and show some value, get some users using it, and that's going to start to engender a goodwill and enthusiasm across the organization. And you know you're doing it properly when you have business leaders or department heads or application owners who come to you and say, hey, security team, I hear you're doing something interesting. I hear you solve this authentication problem or this access problem for my peer over here. How can my team, how can my application get on board? So I think giving departments and agencies the tools to do this, as well as the guidance of how to start and how to incrementally build value, is really setting them up on a really good pathway to success.
In my opening remarks, I mentioned the federal government's increased use of IoT. So how will IoT, or what impact will zero trust have on IoT? Let's start with Stephen.
It's going to be huge, and it's interesting. You'll find OT and IoT in places you never expected. We're renovating a bunch of our facilities right now, and the amount of IoT that's popping up is just incredible. We've got new exercise bikes for the employee gym that happen to connect to our Wi-Fi. We've got lighting systems that are intelligent and super lead efficient, but they need network access. They need to be able to get out to the internet. And so thinking about, in a zero trust world, how do we start to allow these type of IoT devices onto our network while still maintaining security around them is a challenge, because most of the time we like to think about SASE as an intermediary layer, secure access service edge, on our journey towards full zero trust architecture. And one of the cores of that approach is that, well, you're going to have a smart client on the endpoint that's able to move network packets around and interrogate the host, et cetera. IoT, you don't get that luxury. And so what we're looking at in that space is we've got some super brilliant people out at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at NIST, and they're looking at a lot of different ways where actually, maybe we can interrogate those endpoints. Maybe we can understand more about them just by virtue of their behavior and how they operate, which is fantastic, because that's what we're talking about with zero trust, understanding behavior. We can get an identity assigned and we can get behavior, we can start to figure out how they fit into the puzzle.
And I think what zero trust can do in those environments for your exercise bikes and your smart light bulbs and your IP cameras also is provide secure remote access into those environments, so that a vendor who manufactures maybe not the light bulbs, but industrial control systems or HVAC systems can reach in, provide proactive maintenance, provide firmware updates and things like that, but do it in a way that doesn't give them full VPN access and is also reduced to its absolute minimum. Maybe there's a business process where they say, hey, we need to update your HVAC system, or check out, make sure everything's working. Great, here's your hour window once a month at 2 a.m. Those types of things are very well suited to zero trust. There's, as Stephen mentioned, interesting things you can do with network devices that sit upstream from these IoT devices to make sure that even though those things are not secure, that you do have a security layer around it that uses these dynamic policies and provides secure remote access, as well as controlling access from those devices up to wherever they need to go.
Just to add to that, first a disclaimer so the compliance police don't come after me. Yes, compliance is important. Yes, compliance is necessary. Compliance is one tool in the toolbox. It's not the only tool. That was my point. One other thing here before I talk IoT. So Stephen mentioned the NCCOE, and within NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that is where the playbook is going to be written on how the government is going to approach zero trust. And I know Appgate was chosen as one of the firms to assist NIST in thinking through what a zero trust architecture for the federal government should look like. So for those who are listening here, pay very close attention to what NIST is doing and what they're going to produce in collaboration with Appgate and other companies, because that will be the foundational playbook that Stephen and others will be using to move forward. It's absolutely critical. That was a joke, by the way. Absolutely? No, never mind. So I think on IoT, we're so early in the journey here that we're still figuring out what we're going to need from a requirements perspective. That's the good news, because it is still early on. The bad news is there's been a rush for solutions vendor offerings that I think we're getting a little bit into the ready, fire, aim approach. And so to Stephen's point, we're putting in all these fantastic capabilities into government buildings, but we've got to make sure we've got the protocols, the processes in place to ensure that devices are only talking to who they should talk to, when they should talk, and not exploring other things. So whether it's, the old digital control, digital process systems, or the new technology coming down the pike to make all of our lives easier and more interconnected, everything we connect creates an opportunity for bad things to happen. So that's the other part of the mentality, mindset. And when you answer that question, how do I ensure I'm not getting something bad from this interconnectivity? I think that's very helpful from a governance and a risk management perspective.
Yeah, I
If
just
you
want
wanna-
to tag on to that for a moment if I could, because it really drives home a couple capability areas that we talk a lot about in the ZTA space. One is this idea of software defined everything, whether it's perimeter, whether it's segmentation, whether it's WAN or LAN. The ability to truly morph and shape your network topography in real time at the speed of light becomes essential in this space, because in a perfect world, we're microsegmenting. We're only allowing devices the ultimate path to where they need to go, and they don't get to wander anywhere else. The other part of that it leads into, and this is more forward leaning as we look at, how does zero trust as an architecture evolve? Deception has become a very powerful space that we're talking at, because once we identify anomalous behavior or things that seem odd, why is an IoT device trying to scan my network? That seems really strange. Well, if we have software-defined networking, we can move it over into a honeynet, stand up a honeypot, looking somewhat like what they might be looking for, and then see if we can collect information on their tools, their tactics, and then drive it right back into that data repository to strengthen our defenses. And that's the real promise of zero trust, is being able to bring all the data together and take quick actions across the control fabric.
Stephen, one thing that I wanted to know was, what do you see as the art of the possible with zero trust?
Oh, yeah. So here's the best part about zero trust architecture, in my opinion, is that the art of zero trust is a phenomenal end user experience. And I talk to my folks about this all the time. There's no more remembering, did I connect the VPN? Did I disconnect the VPN? There's no more, why do I really need to have this level authentication when it's this level of data? Because all of that is being managed in real time. And as folks need more access, those access requests get automated and they get put into the behavioral mix. And when a human's involved, they're involved. And when the human's not involved, they're not. It's like, if you have the HR systems tied in, it's like, geez, Bob's trying to get access to accounting information he hasn't before. Normally that's shut everything down and call it a day. But if you look and say, whoa, actually, Bob just had a transfer into the accounting department, this actually looks pretty normal. Let's flag it for a human to follow, but let's give him access. And I think that's the real heart of it, is that while we're going to get all this incredible security and risk visibility as part of it, we're also going to drive just an incredible user experience if we're able to fully embrace it and adopt it.
And I don't think that that's been discussed enough, the user experience of that. So thank you for shining a light on that. We talked a little bit about emerging technologies. There were a couple of things that were thrown out, like artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, Stephen, agencies that want to protect high value tech assets, such as cloud, IoT, AI, 5G, how can they do that with a zero trust architecture?
So it really depends how far ahead of the shark somebody wants to jump. There is a lot of great capability in the marketplace that folks can acquire today that brings machine learning to the table, brings AI to the table. Where I would caution that is, if you go down that route, and in many cases it is the right decision to bring in an early but more insular type of provider in that space, especially for the high value assets, think about down the road how you're going to integrate that into the enterprise-wide deployment of machine learning and AI and robotic process automation. Because one of the core elements of zero trust is we have centralized visibility and we're able to make sense of the data fabric across the enterprise. So what I advise to most folks is do it, but also think about the next leap. If you're going to stick with that service and that capability, is the data exportable, and can you affect that service through, say, robotic process automation? If you can, you're probably in a great position. If you can't and it's insular, somewhere down the road, you're going to have to pay the piper for that. And you need to be ready to make that shift and that transition.
Jason?
Yes, if you look at high value assets, I would certainly encourage folks to use a zero trust architecture for this. And one of the key elements to understand is zero trust is not about throwing away everything in security and starting from scratch. It's about building on all of these amazing, well-proven components, whether it's PKI, whether it's identity management, whether it's TLS for encrypted communications, and dozens of others. Zero Trust is about taking a hard look and saying, these things are really not working, and these things are ineffective, and in fact, counter to where we live in our threat landscape. And we'll pick on VPNs as kind of our least favorite remote access technology. What a VPN sits at the entry point to your network and advertises itself to every attacker on the planet, saying, "Here I am. I'm a VPN. Please, try to connect to me and to exploit a vulnerability." You would never design a system like that today, knowing that we have all of these active attackers. So you need to say, all right, there's things in our enterprise that we know are weak. So let's either get rid of them or let's contain them and move to a much better model that from the network layer on up to layer 7, thinks about things holistically and ties into what we need to tie into across our enterprise, whether it's a CMDB or an ITSM service desk for a business process or an identity system, while leveraging the elements of our infrastructure that work. We know identity management systems works. We know MFA works. We know PKI works, et cetera. Let's take those things and deploy a zero trust system that pulls events and data from those, gets more value, helps organizations get more value out of those, and getting rid of the pieces that we know are weak.
So we have some questions from the audience, and some of these we've actually touched on earlier in our conversation. Maybe we can just distill our conversation into just like bite-sized nuggets for people, for the audience to take away. So how should an organization get started with zero trust? Roger, do you want to take that on?
Actually, I was going to ask Stephen to take it on, because then I can then follow up with that, because he's applying it right now, and then I can say exactly what he said.
Okay, Stephen.
First, get the vision out there. And I'll reiterate something I said before. It's not just a technology vision; it's a cultural vision. And I think that those that can also bring in that element of the better user experience, you're going to get more interest, because everybody wants a more seamless experience. Two, you're going to have to do a hard scrub and look at your funding. For us, when we looked at that space, we said, we can move at a certain rate. And like originally, some of our work had a 5-year horizon. And the number one kind of constraint there was around some funding matters. We got creative and we said, there's a technology modernization fund out there, $1 billion Congress has entrusted us with to move security and IT forward and modernize. And this is right in that sweet spot. So we ended up looking at that as a way forward to provide a quick injection of resources to really get the zero trust transition started, because that's frankly the hardest part, is getting it started. Once you have some initial inertia behind it, it rolls pretty quick. People start seeing the value and the benefits. And for us, we use an internal scorecard to track cybersecurity and progress towards systems and different capabilities maturing in the cybersecurity space through zero trust. And we brief that to executive leadership. The deputy secretary sees it, the CIO, of course, sees it, our assistant secretaries see it. It's a big thing. It's a big talking point across the enterprise. And that's where you need to be. It's got to be recognized as this is an agency or department priority for how we're going to do security in the next, frankly, decade.
So what Stephen said. So the military has something called commander's intent, and that is the highest ranking official military officer says, this is what I intend to accomplish through this military campaign. That is my commander's intent. You need to have the same thing in departments and agencies, which means the department head has to be on board with this and has to tell everybody in the organization, this is now a priority for me. It's a priority not just for the IT department or the CIO or the CISO. It's a priority for me as the leader of this organization. So briefing up and then getting them to then say publicly to everyone in the organization, we're going to do this, is absolutely critical. You also got to have your general counsel, your human resources officer, your department heads, all bought in on it. This isn't one of these cases where everyone sits around the table in a senior staff meeting and says, oh, well, Stephen and the IT folks, they'll take care of it. Now let me go back to my day job. No, They have to do that. I do think one of the challenges, though, and I think this is being addressed, is for the rank and file, this comes down to ease of use. So I need to ensure whatever architecture I'm putting in place and implementing increases the ease of use of my staff, of my rank and file, to do their job, to do the mission. And if there's anything about this that complicates it, that's where you get the natural and understandable resistance. So top-down guidance, promote ease of use, understand how the technology fits in to the doctrine, and then empowers the people as you go forward, would be the way I would do it.
Fantastic. Should a zero trust system for critical infrastructure be separate from a secure access for an IT network? I think that's a Stephen question.
I was hoping to pass that one to my Appgate friend, but I will say that the answer is this is not a yes or no question, because the answer is any access into your environment, or and frankly, I use environment, but frankly, what we should be talking about, any access into your resources, your network, your data, your systems, etc. All of that should be part of your zero trust strategy, because the fundamental tenet of zero trust is we're brokering a relationship between a requester and some type of resource, and we're trying to understand, we start trust at zero, how much trust should we provide in this particular situation, and then how do we continuously authenticate that relationship. And when we talk about connecting into something, if you're not doing that through a zero trust architecture capability, that's going to be a blind spot. And to the comment earlier about like the VPN concentrators coming under attack, it will become the new focus of the attack. So I think that anytime we talk about something coming into the enterprise, something accessing our data, if zero trust is not part of the conversation, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
And we'll get Jason's perspective too.
Yeah, I think I would say that it doesn't make sense for them. It does make sense for these environments to be isolated from one another from a network perspective. Clearly, you want to have different enforcement points and separate IT and OT networks. But I would also argue that, as Stephen alluded to, you want to have a single management plane on top of that. And this is for continuity and consistency, but also for efficiency, because if you have a user who needs to access devices, both on the OT and the IT networks, you want to use the same identity system to authenticate them. You want to have one process for onboarding and offboarding that user. And if they leave the organization, you want to be able to turn them off in one place, not have to have a separate process or a system where you forget to turn off their access to the OT environment. So a modern zero trust system will be appropriately architected, so you can have separate points of enforcement and isolated networks, while you get the benefits of a centralized policy model and a centralized mechanism for defining access and authenticating users.
Great. We have time for one question. One more question. And we talked about how zero trust doesn't really require you to replace or get new technologies, right? So in terms of legacy technology or systems, how does zero trust work with the often older systems and network that operate critical infrastructure?
So I'll jump in. So from my perspective, if you think about our critical infrastructure, our OT networks, and let's assume for the moment that we need to leave those things in place because they've been running for 20 years and they need to run for 20 more. As long as they have an IP address, then there are definitely well thought out approaches where you can take zero trust policy enforcement points and put those on the OT networks right in front of or very close to the devices that need to be protected. So you can really isolate them down to a much smaller part of the network than they're on today. And that policy enforcement point is what will control access both to and from those devices. So as long as these things have IP addresses, there's absolutely zero trust technology that's commercially available that can provide that enforcement point, but tie it to this modern infrastructure. And I'll give you a simple example. Let's say there's a piece of critical infrastructure in your network and it uses some sort of proprietary protocol to manage it, but it's got an IP address. You can easily apply modern multi-factor authentication around that so that your end user, your administrator, uses a modern workstation and in order to access that, they have to authenticate to, let's say, a modern cloud-based SAML identity provider, and to use some sort of advanced multi-factor authentication, whatever it is, whatever their hardware supports, before they can access this 20-year-old industrial control system running on a network. Mixing those two worlds works really well, because you have these network level policy enforcement points that a zero trust architecture provides.
So a quick follow-up to Stephen. Legacy systems, zero trust, what's been your experience?
Exactly what was just described. In some situations, the modernization is the right route. You know, if you've got a legacy system and it's been there for 40 years and you haven't modernized in that time, it's probably about time to ask, you know, do we go to the Technology Modernization Fund and ask for the resources to make that big leap and build in ZTA capabilities as part of it? In those situations where it's like, you know, in some cases there is just no way to replace this other than keep it going. That bifurcation and the buffering and the isolation of saying, you know, we're going to put a connector, or I'm going to put a very small device in there, in some cases physically, between the legacy and what's out in the world, and that becomes basically my security broker for accessing legacy. That's also a fantastic approach. And I think as we go forward, we're going to see more and more of that. I think most folks in the ZTA space are aware of this challenge space, and they're coming up with solutions that basically shim security in and a ZTA interface in. And that's going to be important, because whether it's legacy IT or even some of this OT and IoT we're talking about, where I can't deploy a full client on the end, these are solutions that can work to kind of bridge the gap between the smart devices and those that don't have quite the capability to be there with the same telemetry.
Roger, a quick comment from you before we wrap up here.
Well, what Stephen just said about telemetry and just understanding the data that is going to be produced within this type of architecture is really important, and making heads or tails of it in a way that allows everyone within the network to know what it is they're looking at and then to take action based on it is incredibly important. So, you know, the telemetry data component of this, I think, becomes even more critical in the zero trust world.
Great. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for this really insightful conversation. I appreciate everyone's insight. And thank you again to Appgate, who hosted this conversation. I hope to see you soon again and continue these discussions around zero trust.